Hi, my name is Torri Wright, and I'm one of the founders here at BEHCA, which is a behavioral app. And if you are getting this, you likely are already working with BEHCA. And I wanted to take a moment to talk about best practices around collecting behavioral data. So as we get started, first, I just want to say BEHCA, the app, was really developed from my perspective of being a special education teacher, as well as a behavior professional in the community, and feeling frustrated that there wasn't a way to collect meaningful data. And there really weren't tools out there that were collecting the way that I saw it needed to be collected. So I'm going to go over some of those points and why I think certain areas are so critically important. Why do we collect data in the first place? Well, first of all, it helps us learn more about the student and how they're experiencing the world outside of my own perspective. It also allows us to effectively collect baseline data, so that frequency, duration, and intensity. It gives us evidence-based data that tests the efficacy of our intervention. So how effective are the interventions that we have, and are they being used appropriately? And then, of course, the goal development and growth. So our outcomes, are they meeting their goals? So frequently I see IEP plans carried over from one year to another. And my question is always like, why are we doing that? Either we are not modifying enough or understanding the behavior enough to be able to support them. And so that's why I feel like those goal and development outcomes are so critically important to really be reviewing in a meaningful way with data. And then, of course, over time, if you have a collection of data over a year for a particular student, you are absolutely going to be able to identify trends and patterns. So if you have a student that you suspect struggles with transitions when there's holidays, or maybe you have a student that goes from one parent to another, or substitutes, so on and so forth, or you think, man, there's one student that I have that really is on target for like 2 weeks. He seems to have a solid 2 weeks and then they fall off. Collecting data over time really helps us allow the ability to look at those trends and patterns over time. The data itself really tells a story. This is where our hypothesis comes from when we are writing those plans. And this is actually a graph of what of what BEHCA looks like. So we've called out frequency and duration right away of those warning signs and challenging behavior. The middle graph is more of an interactive tool where we can sort of turn on and off different data points to be able to compare and contrast, as well as looking at times and those trends over time. And then finally, you look at the green, which is your goals. So those would be your IEP goals, behavioral, social, academic, potentially, developing those goals, and how frequently are they successfully implementing the skills required to meet that goal. And then the last graph that we're looking at is the warning sign versus intervention. So those warning signs are really our golden information to make sure it's kind of like our hey, there's a warning sign, it's time to provide some level of intervention so that we help them stay regulated. And so it's a great talking point as staff to see how well and effective are we at providing those interventions during a warning sign rather than when the student is in a crisis. So best practices to consider: witnessing the student. I'll talk about what each of these are. I'm going to kind of break them down into sections, but being empathic from a deeper point of view, including like sensory and interactions around the environment. Measurable and observable versus subjective. Testing interventions to really see how effective really are they, or are we doing them appropriately, like I mentioned just a minute ago. And then self-awareness and accountability, looking at that data point really increases our ability to do that. And then influencing variables, so all the things that are happening within our world and in our environment, and then building that story or that hypothesis of what have we noticed that with this collection of data, what have we noticed, so that we can really build a narrative of what is our hypothesis of where these behaviors are coming from. And then finally, with that hypothesis and some of this data collection in this particular format, helps us change and shift our bias, our opinions, and our judgment, specifically around taking things personally, because we love to do that. So when we witness a student, we completely remove ourselves from the situation. So this is a great exercise to do whenever possible. So intentionally schedule time to observe, and this can be more than one staff. It doesn't have to be the same staff every day or twice a day, but really if you could have a staff member 2 times a day, really schedule 5 minutes, free of notes, free of assessment. You're not judging, you're not evaluating, you're just paying attention to how that student is really interacting with other students, how they're interacting to the environment around them, the noises, the lights, the movements of other students, transitions, how they're communicating to other students or responding. Those are all things that are going to tell us a lot more about what they're experiencing. It's going to really tell us the language behind their behavior, those nonverbal cues that sometimes are really easily missed, because oftentimes when we're collecting data on a student, we're waiting until they are in crisis, which crisis point data doesn't really tell us a lot of information. It just tells us that this student is really struggling, and it's going to tell us how frequently and how long and possibly the severity, but it's really not telling us what's leading up to it. What are those variables that influence their dysregulation point? So how many times can they handle a situation before they're in that fully dysregulated state? And then empathy. When we're talking about empathy, it's more than just understanding that they might have a learning deficit or the way that their brain from a neurodiverse point of view is processing. It feels frustrating. It's also about how do they experience the sensory around them. So how are they interacting with their environment is such an important thing, because oftentimes individuals that we meet are likely experiencing something very different than us, but we rarely slow down. We rarely are curious about it. And rarely do we even acknowledge or recognize how different other people are in terms of their sensory integration and how they're interacting with things around us. And then, of course, those social pieces, like I had mentioned, how are they interacting with their peers? How are they interacting with the teacher? Do they shut down? Do they immediately argue? Do they look like they're refusing to do the activity that they're being requested, but then do it 5 minutes later? Those little subtle things really tell us a lot about an individual. It also tells us a lot of information that we can use to effectively modify their environment, modify their schedules, modify our strategies, as well as to develop new interventions. And that kind of leads into that cognitive piece. So the biological, socioeconomic, and cultural, those are really important things to consider, but it is going to take a little bit of time to really understand that, and might require some team collaboration with fellow colleagues, whether it's a psychiatrist or the psychologist, counselor, or case manager, or other teachers, paraprofessionals in the building that really know the student, and if they know any information, that background information. And when you can gain that, just really building a level of empathy, because you're building a whole story. You're really creating a narrative for that student of why are they showing up the way that they are. And when we do that, it allows us to create measurable and observable data points to collect. So those measurable and observable data points are going to be much more fact-based language, which reduces that emotional trigger on our part, as well as how we're interacting with the students. So this is very supportive in the area of trauma-informed practices, positive behavior intervention, as well as restorative justice. Like all of those things are going to be really asking us to be fact-based, really eliminating those opinions and subjective kind of language that we're using to explain their behavior. It also acknowledges the behavior is an extension of them in terms of their communication. And so I see behavior as just an extension of communication all the way around with every human. I don't think it's any different with our students who struggle with a variety of things. And sometimes when they're going through developmental phases with hormones and so forth, or even just younger developmental spaces, that behavior can really be an extension of that communication, because maybe they don't have those skills yet, or they weren't able to develop them to effectively communicate. And so the behavior itself has actually been an effective way for them to communicate. So really looking at it from that point of view really starts to kind of ask us as staff to kind of just take a step back and go, all right, what am I missing? How do I need to look at this student or this behavior in a different lens? When we use subjective language, it really damages our trust, our ability to really connect with that student, because that subjective language, even if we're not using it in front of the student, we might be using it with other colleagues. So we're talking about, oh, Joella in my period 2 class, like she's a real pain. She refuses all the time and she's super sassy. And the way that I'm talking about her has a lot of opinion and subjectivity to it. And it also starts to paint this picture of her that she's doing it maybe on purpose, that she doesn't really care, and that I'm just really frustrated, and maybe I don't even really like having that person in my class. And so just being really mindful of how we are using that subjective language, because it does limit our ability to have those relationships. And I also just want to fully acknowledge the fact that I have definitely worked with individuals over the 26 years that I've been in this field that really trigger me and really get to me. So I think it's a normal human thing to be, to feel frustrated, to be taking things personally, and to like have opinions about stuff. I also believe that sometimes when I'm being reactive, or I don't really have enough information, it's much easier to be in that place of bias than it is to kind of step back and go, gosh, okay, if this really isn't about me, is there something that I can learn? Is there something that I'm missing? And really just encouraging ourselves to become a little bit more curious about things and ask more questions, even within ourselves, as well as our colleagues, to learn. And being mindful that we aren't using those languages, because if I'm using subjective language to describe this individual or this student to my colleagues, not only is it going to influence their opinion and their bias, but it's actually continuing to validate this experience that this child is doing something on purpose, or really difficult to handle. And so it starts to create sort of this persona around this child. And then we miss the opportunity to really help support them and reduce the level of behavior, because we're really not meeting them where they are, and we're completely missing the communication of that behavior in general. Instead, we're making it about us instead of about them. So some examples of this would be, when I'm writing things down, I'm going to look at anything that is measurable and observable, so fact-based, versus that subjectivity. So subjectivity is like where somebody's going to have a very different opinion than maybe I would of whatever is being written. So hood overhead, that's really clear. It's very black and white, clenched fists, muttering under breath, push papers off desks. It's factual. It gives me, when somebody says any of those things, I can visually see and imagine what that looks like. The subjective things, like they were rude, inappropriate language, disrespectful, made a threat. All of those things they're unclear. They're left for interpretation of the person who's hearing it. And if I say they are rude or inappropriate language, the person I'm talking to might be actually going to a completely different thought. Whereas if I say they rolled their eyes at me and walked away and threw their paper, like flung their papers off the desk, that gives me a clear example of somebody who maybe we can say they're being rude, but I have a clear picture of exactly what their behavior is telling me. One way, I might think they don't trust me, or they're testing to see, like, am I a safe person? Am I going to be reactive to that state? So if I am reactive, well, then I'm just validating the fact that I am not a safe person. I'm instead being reactive to them. So using that language is really important to change our perspective, as well as how we're communicating to one another as staff. In addition to that, I would also say that by using more measurable and observable communication within BEHCA, as well as our documentation, we communicate with the parents differently. And having been a SPED teacher, I know that that can be such a tricky place, because parents sometimes can have an opinion, just like teachers can have an opinion. And oftentimes those opinions clash, or they're at odds. And a lot of it has to do with, when I really look at the data, I should say the documentation, not just the data, there's a lot of subjective language that can be interpreted from teacher to parent very differently. And so when we shift over to that measurable and observable kind of data collection and documentation, Now, all of a sudden, it kind of reduces those tensions because the parent sees exactly what is happening, and the parent can likely understand what is going on because they too have seen the hood over the head. They too have seen the muttering under the breath. Those are things that they have likely experienced. And so now you become a collaborator and an ally of one another to be supportive, rather than your kid was rude today or they were very disrespectful. That can feel really offensive to a parent. And so just making sure that that language is really clear, it's a great way to reduce those tensions, if nothing else. So testing interventions. This is super important because so frequently when we collect data, oftentimes data is usually collected around challenging and complex behavior. Well, if we're collecting just challenging behavior, that means the person is in crisis. So if we're collecting at the same time the intervention that we used, it's likely going to be unsuccessful because we aren't actually getting it before the dysregulation. We're waiting too long. And it's really not that the intervention was ineffective, it's that we were ineffective in getting in front of it. And so really making sure that we're checking our data points of, do we get that warning sign? Do we provide the intervention? And do we provide it before they were in a dysregulated state? As well as, do our staff even know? Do all of the paraprofessionals and teachers that the student is in contact with, do they even know the warning signs? If it's in BEHCA, it should be very easy to be able to see and communicate from one staff to another because all the warning signs are really clearly listed. And then in addition to that, those interventions that have been carried over from one year to another, make sure that they're still effective because sometimes they've run their course. And I'll just let you know that, again, from my very long history in this field, you know what? I might have an intervention that's working amazingly for 6 months, and then I have to kind of change it up because for whatever reason, that intervention is no longer working. And we have a different kind of behavior even, and it feels really frustrating. But I will tell you that if I can be humble enough to say, gosh, I worked really hard on creating that intervention and coming up with these plans, but I can see that 6 months later, we're starting to regress a little bit. Okay, we need to either add in some new interventions or change up the way that we're doing it or modify the environment. So always just being flexible in that state. So specifically looking at warning versus crisis behavior. So those warning signs are really going to be more subtle changes. They're typically not going to be loud or in your face. And so that means that they're often overlooked. Because let's face it, we're busy. We have lots of students, lots of things are going on. We are trying to manage the best that we can throughout the day. And so paying attention to those warning signs might be a little bit more difficult. However, I will say if you have a student who regularly struggles with this, with like challenging behavior or more complex behavior, it really is our number one cue to be able to provide that intervention to help them be regulated. Because if they get to that dysregulation or crisis, first of all, we're contributing to ongoing trauma that they're experiencing, because I'm sure that it doesn't feel very good to have a dysregulated moment in front of your peers or around other people. And I can also pretty much guarantee they don't want to become dysregulated. Their nervous system is saying something isn't right and I better freak out. It doesn't seem rational, doesn't make a lot of sense, but for whatever reason, their little nervous systems are going, gosh, this just doesn't feel very good. I need to survive at all costs. And so that's really where that dysregulation is coming from. And we missed some of those warning signs. And so really paying attention to that is super important. And that's where that witnessing for that 5 minutes is super, super important, because we might find that during those times, we notice that there's like little agitation moments and we see like, oh my gosh, they actually put their head down for a couple of minutes, and that isn't written down as one of their warning signs, but that could actually be a point where checking in with that student when their head is down could be the best thing that we could do. Or even offering them a break to go move their body, maybe not even asking to talk, but maybe they just need to go move their body. That could be literally the thing that we build a really solid connection and a trusting relationship, as well as we reduce the ability or reduce the frequency of that crisis and dysregulation. That's why warning signs are so important. When they're still in that warning sign phase, they can be redirected. That's a great time to like potentially interact with them on a higher level of communication. If you're meeting them at their capacity, their brain is still somewhat present. Whereas when we're managing that crisis, really what we're doing is we're just managing the situation to make sure everybody is safe, including them. And it isn't an effective time to provide an intervention because that inner ear muscle starts to drop, which means they're not hearing you. Their facial muscles might start to fall flat, eyes become dilated, heart rate is up, blood pressure is up. And what that actually means is they might even misread your cues. And now it's really time for you to just co-regulate, which means getting your nervous system super calm so that you can support whatever really challenging situation they're about ready to go into. And another thing to keep in mind is your space, proximity, like giving a lot of proximity, making sure that you've cleared the space of other students, and then just validating that it's a super frustrating experience and not taking things personal, but just being like, I hear you. That's really tough. Even if what they're saying is completely inappropriate and you don't agree with it, like just validating that whatever they are experiencing is really challenging, because it probably is. And being a little bit more quiet, limiting our verbal interactions during that time. So that's what we're doing when we're managing crisis. We're not really saying, hey, let's go for a walk. Probably not the greatest idea. So self-awareness and self-accountability, this is really, I would say, probably one of the biggest things, because working in the field of behavior, both in schools as well as outside of schools in the community, I've just noticed that there's a lot of communication around like fixing the child, making the behavior stop, and really like, what can we do to make that child be different, rather than realizing that sometimes the staff actually need to show up differently. That requires a lot of flexibility. It also requires me to realize that it's not about me, that the behavior is so triggering that I as a human might be getting frustrated, but recognizing that when I'm becoming reactive, I have a responsibility to make sure that I'm doing some self-talk or removing myself from the situation, tagging in another person, doing whatever I can to support my human experience, because that's the reality of this. It's normal. I think every person hearing somebody yell at you, make threats, call you names, it's really hard not to take it personal. I've been doing this for 26 plus years, and there are still individuals that it's like they'll say the thing and I'm just like, gosh, they got me again. But if I can, for a moment, really step back, I find humor is a great strategy for myself. I'll usually make a joke, because then it reminds me more than anything to not take myself too seriously. So if I'm not taking myself too seriously, I don't have a high likelihood of becoming really reactive from a personal space. And it also might make them laugh, which then is a distraction to the dysregulation. And then I've already talked a little bit about co-regulation and what that looks like. But for us to really be an effective co-regulator, we need to really be aware. We need to be aware of our nervous system. What kind of traumas am I coming in with? What experiences am I coming in with? Am I taking care of myself? So I'm like in my A game? Probably not. Let's face it. We've been through a lot the last few years. And so what can we do to kind of adjust that and get through those 6+ hours throughout the day where we are interacting with students that sometimes really can challenge us? It's not easy, but it does require a lot of reflection, possibly even talking with other colleagues, and being willing to be flexible and change the way we're thinking as well as the way we're approaching the behavior. Data helps us with that self-accountability, because we can see if I'm just tracking challenging behavior and I'm forgetting the warning signs, or I'm maybe tracking the warning signs, but I'm forgetting to track those interventions. The question is, did I forget to actually do the intervention? So really looking at those data points and seeing how effective am I being at doing the tasks, but also tracking to show what is it that has been effective, or what am I tracking? So if I'm forgetting to track the interventions, but I'm actually doing them, go back and put them in, because that's a really important thing to look at. Because if it wasn't effective, then the question becomes, is the intervention an effective intervention for that person at that particular time? So when we are able to do this, and we're looking at all these data points that are measurable and observable, so that fact-based, it also allows us to kind of take a step back and really look at things and go, gosh, this student really has a lot going on. There's a lot of things that maybe I hadn't considered because I don't have that same experience or I don't have that same history. But now kind of looking at it all together, it really lets me see this from a different viewpoint and recognizing that it's more of a survival, subconscious way of reacting to the environment, which is really coming from the nervous system. And there's a deep need for connection or a sense of purpose, sense of belonging and empowerment in our world. So just really being willing and flexible enough to kind of step back and look at things from that perspective can be extremely helpful. When we're talking about the environment, these are things that often are very much out of our control, but if we know about them, we can modify certain things. So noises, lights, textures, crowds, proximity of other students, transitions, schedule changes, staff changes, weather, all those things can really have a lot of influence, especially with some kids. Some kids, these are really critical. And if you're not looking at these, I don't know that the interventions are really going to be that effective, especially if you have somebody that you feel like you've tried everything with, but you haven't really looked at those environmental factors to then try to modify anything. That can be some of the most powerful information. So BEHCA allows you to really look at those things, especially as you're kind of witnessing that student and kind of taking notes and adjusting your data according to that. And then that falls in line with your health. So these are more internal. You're not necessarily going to see them unless the person can communicate. Sometimes we're having to guess, but like migraines, headaches, allergies, constipation, those are all things that create a really deep discomfort within a person's body. And if they don't know to communicate that, or they don't have a way to communicate it, that can show up in some really challenging behavior. So making sure that we are looking at these things, we're possibly even talking with the parents and saying, do you think that this is a possibility, especially if we're suspecting that? And then, of course, any kind of historical pieces, whether they're going through a current hardship, big life events or changes, trauma. Of course, trauma is a really big one. Sometimes we're going to know this information, sometimes we are not. So I just want to offer that, if the person is experiencing challenging behavior and also has an IEP with any sort of eligibility, they likely are living in a world that says they don't really fit in. They're probably struggling socially. They're probably trying to figure out why things aren't easy for them, and it maybe is easier for their peers. And of course, developmentally, this is going to be different depending on the age group. But just paying attention to that, again, getting out of our own experiences as much as we can and trying to put ourselves in an empathic way in their shoes and really paying attention to, man, what does their world really look like? And what might that look like and feel like? So can I see that? Can I connect on that level? All of this information and all these data points really allow us to build that hypothesis or that story. You can get a pretty solid hypothesis if you have a substantial amount of data within 2 months. You're going to get your baseline data, your frequency, duration, and intensity. You're going to also be able to tell whether the interventions that you've been trying are working, especially if you have your warning signs and your interventions effectively tracked. You're going to also see if the goals are starting to be implemented. Like, are they building skills because of this? Sometimes the goals aren't going to come until later because we need to find that baseline data decreasing a little bit. So kind of addressing the challenging behavior before those goals start developing. So as you know, you need to be able to, it's super important for a student to feel secure and have a foundation before those skills can be built. So that's really important to remember, that sometimes when we're carrying goals over, it's maybe because we didn't do the foundational work to get them to feel safe and secure and connected. How can we build that? What can we do? So really thinking about that as well. What are kind of interventions that we can do that would build those pieces? So BEHCA itself stands for Behavior, Environment, Health Comparative Analysis. That's a lot to say. That's why we use BEHCA. But really what it is it's a tool that is looking at kind of the whole picture of an individual, and we're kind of comparing and looking at those variables with the behavior and comparing and finding the analysis based on that. And with those data points, our hope is that that will then shift the perspective, recognizing that it's an extension, the behavior is just an extension of their communication, that there is a lot going on with the student that maybe we didn't recognize before. There's variables that we hadn't really considered. And now all of a sudden we have a little bit more compassion and empathy when we are approaching that student. That alone, by the way, will completely shift the way that you're interacting with them. If we are no longer taking things personal, now we're not being reactive. Now we're avoiding power struggles. And if we could actually do that just by tracking data from this broader perspective, that's amazing to me. So sometimes it's really just the information starts to inform our bias or our opinions a little differently. So then it changes the way that we're approaching the individual. And so ultimately, that's the goal of being able to look at all of these things. If you or your team has any questions or additional feedback, maybe there's additional pieces within BEHCA that you would like us to cover as to why it's built that way or how to better utilize it, please feel free to reach out to us at hello@BEHCA.com. In addition to that, if you have a particular circumstance that is really challenging, or you are just kind of scratching your head of like how to track a data or track specific data, or you're trying to just kind of like figure out some approaches, I am always available. I love collaborating. I love helping solve problems. That's really the reason why we built BEHCA in the first place. So please use me as a resource. I am super happy to do that. And just for fun, here are some resources, recommended resources. Most of these are somewhat newer. The Mindset and Trying Differently Rather Than Harder are a little bit older, but they're really important. Diane Melvin and Daniel Siegel have been around for a long time. What Happened to You by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey is just a fabulous read in general about trauma. See Beyond Emotions, this is a book that I actually wrote, and it is more around how to really become very attuned to your own nervous system and being an amazing co-regulator by developing these better skills. And then Polyvagal Exercises for Safety and Connection. That's from Deb Dana. It's more of a therapeutic approach around that polyvagal theory. And then Making Friends with Monsters. Highly, highly recommend this. I think it would be a great resource to use certain aspects of this if you are a middle school or high school teacher. I also think that it's just a fabulous read. She does an incredible job of really talking about like mental health and those voices inside our heads and how we can become explosive and really be frustrated, and then how it kind of goes through our head and so forth. Just an incredible read. I read it in a very quick amount of time because I just couldn't put it down. It was a really fabulous story in general. So again, just to close this session, please reach out to us at hello@BEHCA.com if you have any further questions or feedback. I thank you so much, and I hope this was helpful for you.